Welcome, Priya. It's so good to have you here.
Thank you, Nina. It's good to be here.
And I'm going to call you by your first name because we know each other, even though you've got this amazing background and you have a doctorate in education and all that cool stuff. So you and I have known each other for a few years, and all I know is that we've had similar values since the beginning is how I think about us. I think, and again, different things too. We're very different people, but both of us have a strong value around inclusion. And one of the things I was really excited about having you on as a guest is you've really done something with that. Like, I'm flirting around the edges and I've got my podcast and I try to keep my toe in the water. But you've got this amazing company called the Roundtable Institute where you do work with leaders, with coaches, really helping them develop their leadership, but also be more inclusive as leaders. And I've said enough already, so I'm kind of curious from your perspective, like, what had you found your own company? Because that's a big undertaking.
Yeah, it was never part of the plan.
Yeah.
So as you know from coaching leaders, so much of how we navigate our careers is not part of a plan. Things happen serendipitously, or something unexpected happens, and we catch an opportunity and we go with it. But the time that I started Roundtable was 2016, November 9th. And if you live in the United States, or if you were paying attention to what was going on in the United States, that was the day that Donald Trump was elected president. And it was as though I woke up that morning, like so many people in the United States, feeling as though we couldn't believe it. It wasn't real. It felt like a nightmare. And my first thought was, oh my gosh, this is gonna ruin or minimize or dismiss the voices of women and people of color and people with disabilities and people who identify as non-binary and transgender people, basically anyone who is underrepresented. And I felt like this surge of energy. Okay, this is the moment. I have a track record of success as a coach. I've been with a company for a while. That company is great, but not really doing anything in the way of uplifting underrepresented voices. So maybe this is the moment.
Yeah.
And so I registered Roundtable that morning. Because it was like everyone around me. I was on a business trip in Atlanta. I woke up in a hotel room, got my laptop, and said, okay, we're just going to register this company and then see what happens. And I was just going to be myself, doing the same work I had been doing, but focusing on women and underrepresented people, LGBTQ, people of color, etc. And that's what I did for a few years. And then companies were like, hey, well, we like what you're doing. Can we send everyone to your programs? And pretty soon it was like, if I wanted to say yes to that and serve a broader range of people, then I had to build a team. Yeah. So build the team, and here we are.
Very cool. Very cool. And I really appreciate the acronym that you're using. And there's so many different acronyms in this space, but the acronym of JEDI, which stands for Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. And I would love your take on why JEDI versus all the other ways we can talk about DEI.
Yeah, there are lots of ways to talk about it. I mean, a lot of people include the B for belonging, and there's a lot of, JEDI, first of all, it just sounds cool, right? It sounds like, yeah, I want to call myself a JEDI leader or JEDI coach. But actually, when I thought about it, to me, the word justice has to come first, because justice is about how we treat people, period. It is the value that underscores equity, diversity, and inclusion. So I can't do a program personally without justice. It's also personally my top value. My world needs to feel in balance. My life needs to feel in balance. My relationships, my diet, the things I do with my time, all of that needs to feel just and equitable and balanced in my life. So, and it feels like the biggest term of the four. It feels like the first one. And It also feels sometimes neglected because it is amorphous. It's hard to define what justice is. But it's easier to define equity, diversity, and inclusion.
Right.
And I think the reason for that is because justice is so big, it's all encompassing, and it's hard to operationalize it. But it, to me, is the entry point to these other topics around equity, diversity, and inclusion.
That's so cool that it's the entry point for you. And because I think it is the most edgy for organizations to be thinking about. And maybe that's my unconscious bias, or because I haven't spent as much time linking business and justice, but I definitely see the opportunity. And it is like, it is partially about fairness, right? And but that's also what equity is about. So when you're doing work with leaders and you bring in the justice part of the JEDI model, like how do you make it attractive for leaders, or is it just that you're attracting people who already have a value set around justice? What's going on there?
Not always. Sometimes, we work with leaders who see the imperative, and we don't have to do any work to convince them. They come to us. Yeah. But other times, you do have to help people to understand or see or explore this idea that you can't have good leadership without thinking about justice. Good leadership is just, is inclusive, is equitable. They're not different vectors of the same pie, right? They're they're the same thing. The same way a leader should be thinking about values, a leader should be thinking about identities. The same way a leader should be thinking about strategy and executive presence, like all these words that we put in the same Venn diagram of leadership, needs to include justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion. They're not separate. And when leaders see that, it's like, oh yeah, no brainer. Why are we treating them differently in our company? Why do we have a DE&I, person who's separate from everything else? And when they start to see that all of us as leaders need to be taking on that mantle, it starts to become clear. The work of leadership starts to become a little bit clearer.
So we were talking about the J in JEDI, and yes, I think it's very cool. And I don't think we should overlook that, because I think this work deserves to be viewed as cool. Like I'm worried right now. So help me, not be less worried, but let's commiserate for a minute. My impression is that people want to move on a little bit from this work, and that we're not done. We're not even halfway done. And I'm wondering what you're seeing out there in terms of companies' willingness to be in these conversations and include DEI and JEDI leadership development as part of their strategic, initiative and planning and values. So I'm kind of curious what you're seeing as a consultant there.
So this is interesting. So I don't think of myself as a DE&I consultant, never have, and probably won't. Why? Because there are people who are doing that work, specializing in that work, and they're doing way more work around diversity, equity, and inclusion than I'm doing. My swim lane is leadership. And in leadership, there's a lot you can do with strategy and consulting and diversity, equity, inclusion. But to me, if you treat them separately, like we were just talking about, then I think you have a different project with DE&I consulting. Okay. Now, I haven't noticed the same trend. I've noticed more appetite for understanding what the business imperative of diversity, equity, and inclusion is. What I've noticed, though, is the way we talk about leadership needs to be aligned with the evolving nature of DE&I. It's moving really fast. The language is changing. It's hard to keep up with it. And leaders don't know where to start. And there's a lot of fear around, how do I get into it? How do I do it right? What if I get it wrong? So as a coach, my perspective is that I'm trying to constantly think about, what is great leadership? Today, you can't do great leadership without thinking about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I'm a leadership coach. I'm a leadership consultant.
I'm so glad you made that distinction. You probably have to do it all the time. So my apologies if it's like old news for you. But yes, absolutely. Like, it's why I do this podcast, is because I do believe it is the cutting edge of great leadership, and we can't ignore it. We can't put it in its own lane. It really belongs kind of front and center. And I imagine you have some really cool models that help leaders get in touch with this and be more connected to not only why it matters, but how to do it, like how to be a more inclusive leader.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of like when you're coaching someone, sometimes the topics that you bring up with your coachee can feel provocative to them or uncomfortable to them. For example, talking about values can be new and unfamiliar to some of our clients. And talking about identity is the same thing. It can be new, it can be unfamiliar, it can feel like, oh, I don't want to talk about that. But I think our job as coaches is to push people into the zones that feel a little bit uncomfortable, but where they can, it's the zone of where they can most maximize their potential and grow and learn and be more effective. So I think that's the edge. That's the edge, is it's no different. Talking about identity, power dynamics, privilege, representation is no different than talking about what you want, your goals, your values, and who is the person you're meant to be. Ultimately, when we're coaching leaders, that's the question we're asking. Who are you meant to be? And if we're not talking about identity in that conversation, then we're getting it wrong. We're missing a whole big chunk of who that person is.
And I mean, we do talk about identity from the perspective of values, but you're absolutely right. There is so much more discomfort I find inside the companies I work in with that other conversation about what groups do you identify with? How do other people perceive you versus how you perceive yourself? It feels like such an important conversation for leaders to be in for themselves. Like, it does start with self-awareness. And I think that's one thing we would probably agree on, that we both know that if you aren't doing the work individually, you're not going to be able to include more different voices, because you don't know what, like, I don't like the word blind spots because it's exclusive in its own way, but there is no other better way to think about the things that are unconscious too, right? Like the things that are under that iceberg that have gone unexamined, that you haven't reflected on.
Right. And there's so much, race, gender, sexual orientation, ability, body type, etc., is part of it. But you're right, there's tons of rich conversation you can have under that iceberg.
So I asked you in advance to talk a little bit about who or what inspires you. And you had an amazing list. First of all, you're very well read. I wrote down 3 of the authors you mentioned. I was like, I gotta go check out these fiction writers. I've never heard of a couple of these people. So that was really cool to learn about. But you also mentioned moms being an inspiration to you. Are you willing to, because the reason I thought of it is I also think that when we're on a team or in a space and we're working towards including everyone and seeing everyone, one of the things that happens is we might have people who have a certain experience or making certain choices in their personal life that are different from others. And we can unintentionally exclude people. Like, we can exclude the one person in the room who doesn't have children because we're talking about parenting and being a mom and just assuming everyone understands the elements of that. Or it could be the opposite. We could be talking about our big fancy vacations and our wonderful things. And we could forget that there are people in the room who maybe they're not struggling to put their checks together, but they don't have a lot of discretionary money for fun and interesting things as either as a parent, because they're raising their kids or whatever. So long-winded way of me asking, what is it that inspires you about moms?
That's a good question. It just so happens that the people who inspire me most are moms. Yeah. And I think that when you become a mom, now I'm speaking from a perspective as a mom, but also my best girlfriends are moms.
Yes.
They do special things. I think that this biological experience of feeling so deeply attached to your kids, and sometimes it's not purely biological, right?
Yes.
But being attached to these kids and feeling as though your priorities have changed, and the way that the world, like being a mom requires an understanding of the world and how it impacts your children, and protecting them from certain things, but also allowing certain things that are heartbreaking, right? Sometimes we have to see our kids go through the most heartbreaking things because we know it's good for them. So it's humbling. It's absolutely disarming. There's a clarity in moms. There's a way in which I can connect with moms that it's like a knowing, and yeah, we've been there. Like it is one of the most natural experiences in the world, but I also feel so unique. I think we're at a point in time when the world is demanding more and more and more from moms. And even as moms feel pressure, I don't see moms cowering to that pressure. I see them rising above and uplifting each other and doing it together. And it's like, bring it on. Like, it's unfair. I think that moms carry so much burden, but it has not stopped them from rising to the challenge and protecting, our most precious asset.
Yes, yes. And I too have an affinity for the role of being a mom, but also the dual demands for working mother, or women who work outside the home, and and they're still statistically not getting enough help at home. So we could talk about, a lot of these things are the magic of being a parent even, right? And yet we do know that there's often someone in the household who's the greater caregiver, and often it's falling on the shoulders of women, or women who identify as women. So it is inspiring that they're holding so much. And I would like to live in a world where it felt more equitable. So it kind of fits in with the rest of our
because we can do it doesn't mean we should, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And if you see, like, even women at the top who are maybe a little bit older than us, they've gotten there because they've had a supportive spouse at home, usually, oftentimes. So we're replicating in business. I think we're replicating this model that's starting to shift. I think the millennials are figuring it out. I'm seeing a lot more change at the level of like the 35 plus to 45. And you're probably a millennial, Priya.
Right on the border. I'm Gen X.
Okay. Sometimes I assume younger women are my age, and I don't know if they want me to be making that assumption. So it's great. But so I do want to talk about something that's near and dear to both of us, which is, so if we want leaders to have these, to include inclusion, or be JEDIs, so not just be looking at leadership through the traditional lenses that we have in the past, and include more of this as part of their effectiveness. I was even talking to my other guest, Dr. Elijah, recently, and we were talking about how he's a trans man, and everything that he had to learn when he transitioned, and of course he transitioned to something that was for him more true to who he was, but all of it could be applied to navigating change for all of us. Like, we're all in transition all the time. And I was thinking about, like, even that experience of how much we can learn from people who are different from us, rather than worrying or being afraid of it, or just thinking it's weird or wrong, right? Like, there's so much opportunity to learn from people who are walking different paths. So that's my little rah-rah for that. And I wanted to mention, we want to talk about your coaching program, because you've actually developed a JEDI program that helps coaches coach leaders around these topics. And so I'm really curious about what makes that program unique. Like, what are you trying to do there?
Yeah, it started because, as you know, Nina, there's a lot of firms just like Roundtable Institute, small boutique coaching firms who coach leaders. And a few of those firms approached us and said, "Oh, you're doing this work around inclusive leadership. Are you doing it for coaches too?" And at first I was like, no, that's not our swim lane. But the more it happened that people were asking for that, the more I was like, maybe we should think about this, because it turns out what I heard from those people is the coach training programs they're going to are not really paying attention to how do you bring in this identity lens, this power lens, how do you bring in inclusion into your coaching work? And students wanted it. And so they were left on their own to try to figure that out. And that's a lot of work to figure out, especially if you're a new coach or you've just got a few years under your belt.
Yeah.
So it turns out we were well positioned to answer the question of how do you bring justice, equity, diversity, inclusion into your coaching practice? Yeah. And it's for all coaches, whether you're coaching, it doesn't matter who you're coaching. Like some people think, there's like this misconception that I need to have a different skill set if I'm coaching, quote, diverse candidates. And honestly, that term like totally drives me nuts, because everyone's diverse. Like, what do you mean diverse? And actually everyone deserves to talk about who they are and where they came from and be understood and seen along those lines. And so this program has been designed, number one, to accommodate these shifting dynamics where you can't be an effective leader today if you're not paying attention to the dynamics of equity, inclusion, and diversity, as we've already talked about. So that means coaches need to upskill and be conversant in that dialogue and have the skills and tools and language to talk about social identity, talk about discrimination, bias, power, and privilege, not as separate pieces of a leader's journey, but as intrinsic to the leader's journey. All of us experience bias, discrimination, unfair treatment, inequity in our workplaces. So the first thing we do is we set the table by talking about power dynamics in the coaching relationship. And so that means I have to examine who I am as a woman who speaks with this accent, living in the United States with, Indian heritage, blah, blah, blah. And I have to examine what that means for my client who may have very different social identities than me. Beautiful. And start a conversation there, because it inherently creates a power dynamic between us. There's also the natural power dynamic that clients ascribe to us because we are the coach. And we want to kind of level, not dismantle the power dynamic because it always exists, but problematize it and talk about it and examine it because it's there. And it's there when our leaders are working with their teams and with their clients, et cetera. They're going to have to be equipped to talk about it too.
Yeah. Yeah. So really normalizing power, like
normalizing
as a
power
dynamic.
And having the tools to talk about it and have a constructive dialogue around it. Cool. We also talk about privilege and how that plays out. We talk about the coaching agenda, which is probably influenced deeply by power dynamics, by dynamics in their workplaces, like to really examine the agenda we as coaches hold for our clients and what biases we're imposing on that agenda and thinking about it. So we have a whole session just on identity and the mechanics of talking about identity and why it's important for our leaders that we coach to know who they are. And then we talk about
it's so go ahead. You go ahead.
Yeah. And then we talk about the importance of range in your coaching practice and how to attract a diverse range of clients, the kind of clients that you would never dream or think that would approach you to work with.
Yeah.
And how do we attract and create a welcoming space for any client to work with us?
Wow. All of those sound like valuable topics, even for me, 19 years into my practice. And so I could see, and I know that coaching schools are going to catch up. Like even Coactive is working on, including context that your clients are coming from in the naturally creative, resourceful, and whole conversation. And but I think even with that, I think having a separate space to go deeper with these conversations would be super powerful. And you're also reminding me of something that I did intuitively about 5 years ago. Is I had been doing values work in my foundation session, And I felt like I never really got to know my clients. And so I changed it up. And it was based on a coach actually who did it with me, Helen House, from our coactive community. I did like more of a life history. So it's the only time, we have this taboo about don't go in the past with your clients, don't go in the past. But even if from a leadership lens, if you look at it from like, what are the leadership lessons? What are your highs and lows? And I want to hear them about you personally, not just professionally. How did they affect who you are as a leader? And that first conversation, I mean, literally, what was life like for you, 0 to 10? What was it like 11 to 21? Like it really allowed us to go deeper sooner, allowed me to understand some things that on the surface I wasn't seeing from my clients. Maybe they're in professional services and they've got, a big job and they grew up working class and they grew up worried about, the next meal. Like that actually happens in these conversations. And that stuff doesn't show up if you just are doing values work and just focusing on fulfillment in your coaching or on vision, right? Totally. And so I think that understanding who your clients are, and then I also really love what you're saying about the power dynamics. Like, how do you design that alliance with your client that actually makes transparent things that you might be navigating as a coach anyway, and making assumptions about your client that aren't actually accurate?
That's it. So that third workshop called The Identity is where we talk about having a really courageous conversation with your clients about like, what assumptions do you have about me as your coach now that we've been working together for a few weeks, and here are the assumptions I had about you, and what does that mean for the world of work that you're in? What are the assumptions people are making about you, and what assumptions, biases are you holding about others, and how do you actually have a conversation about that to feel understood and get closer to understanding the people around you?
Yeah, so be really courageous in those conversations. It sounds like.
Yeah.
Well, I have one question for you, and I think it might be valuable for our listeners too, and it probably is covered in your program. So maybe we're cheating a little bit by sharing it here. But sometimes I wonder if I am falling into a trap, because I have a systems lens, and so I'm working with a mentee or a leader that I'm coaching, so one-on-one conversation, and they do bring up something to me that has a systemic connection. Like, they might be talking about having enough time for themselves, and I bring up, or they may bring up how people perceive them at work, or not getting ahead at work, and I'm like, well, do you think the fact that you're a Black woman has anything to do with that? And so I'm more fearless now about asking about those things. But then I do this thing that I'm not so proud of, where it feels like maybe I'm not holding them as whole or as resourceful, because I'm kind of helping them make an excuse for why they're not getting what they need. So I'm really curious about balancing the systems lens that we can bring to coaching. Yes, there's systemic issues. Yes, there are structures in place that keep you from reaching your untapped potential unless we work on them, right? And then there's also stuff that you can work on internally. And that tension point, I don't think I always get it right. Sometimes I feel like I'm too soft or I'm making assumptions. So I'm kind of curious how you would mentor me on that.
It's a great question. And I've noticed the same tension. I've experienced the same sort of thing. But as a psychologist, if I wear my psychologist hat for a moment, okay, so it may feel as though we're making a justification for why you're experiencing this kind of discrimination, and it's a systems thing. But that doesn't mean we can't do anything about it. We still have to learn how to manage living in a system that is oppressive. And we have to learn how to talk about that, manage it, and be a leader in that system, even as we might work to dismantle the effects of that oppression on us and on others. And to me, that's a very rich conversation to have. If your client is willing and able to go there. And I like to push them there, because that is, I think, a really essential conversation. Like, yes, we live in these oppressive systems, but it doesn't mean we have to accept them. It doesn't mean that it determines our faith, right? It doesn't mean it determines our outcomes. But we do have to learn to navigate them, talk about them, and be in conversation with others who are also wanting to dismantle them. And if we're aware of the effects of those systems, then we can work as allies for others too.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Well, I knew you'd have an immediately good, succinct answer. And I know it's more complicated than one answer, but I do. One of the things you're reminding me of is it's just another strategic tension, right? Like, we focus on individual growth, but we don't forget the systems that we're all operating in. Yes. And we may not be able to see all of it. And some of it may not even be impacting us as much as we think it is. Like, I know for me, as I'm getting older, I'm more self-conscious about feeling invisible when I'm facilitating. And so I may be sometimes reading things in about that aren't actually happening. Yeah. So, you know, it's that internalized oppression that we've that we create. Yeah. So how do I let go of that?
Let go of it or problematize it, right? So like, I think the coach has an enormous opportunity here to explore that alongside the client. There are some things that, you know, we talk about it. We have the JEDI for Leaders program and we have JEDI for coaches. In JEDI for Leaders, we say, you know, like, even if you're white, anti-Black racism affects you. It doesn't just affect Black people. And for many of the people going through that program, that is a groundbreaking statement. What? Yeah. This affects me too? And when they see that and accept it, it opens up a different conversation and a different way to bridge conversations and relationships between, you know, across cultures, across races, across genders, etc. Yeah.
Yeah. Yes. Great. You're such a great advocate for this. And of course, I knew you'd be articulate. You're just so smart. You're so smart. Well, I'm getting a sense of your vision for leadership development, but is there anything else you want either executives to know about dipping their toe in this work, or even our
there
coaches?
Is. I think the mantle that I'm willing to hang everything on is that I recognize that this work is really scary. It requires an enormous amount of courage. It's easy to sit on the sidelines, particularly if you have a lot of privilege. And it's tempting, and people are going to push you on the sidelines and don't necessarily want you to be front and center in the conversation because of your particular privileged social identities. But my message and invitation is to recognize that we're going to stumble, and those stumbling blocks are exactly where we learn and where our power lies. So if we don't give ourselves the opportunity to stumble, make mistakes, muck it up, we're missing a huge opportunity to influence others. So the path is going to be imperfect. We have to embrace that. And the antidotes to that are grace and forgiveness. Because I think there's nothing worse sometimes as a leader than feeling as though you've caused harm, you've offended someone, and maybe even worse, it's ruined your reputation, and suddenly somebody's called you a bigot or a racist or a sexist. That's incredibly painful, and I know this work is high stakes for that kind of thing to happen. We have to be willing to take that risk, because I think it's really worth it. The rewards of creating inclusive, courageous spaces far outweigh the risks ultimately. And if we think about it, you know, as a psychologist, I think of life from the lens of development, right? We're constantly developing, and the path to development includes errors. And as those errors become smaller and smaller, we get happier and happier. We experience more and more fulfillment. It's like the baby trying to walk. At first, they're like constantly falling, but they don't give up. Their errors just get smaller and smaller. And they don't completely eliminate. Even at age 45, I trip. And that's part of learning, that we're going to make these errors along the way. It is scary. And we have to recognize that it's scary, that this work is not easy. Yeah.
So glad you said that, normalize that. And I had this thought that we aren't really ever done, because the more inclusive we come, because being inclusive for me is partially about being curious about what we don't know, and being comfortable in the unknown a little bit, like being comfortable being uncomfortable. And so there's always going to be people we don't know enough about and things we don't know enough about. Whether it's, I was just listening to an interview with Barbara Kingsolver talking about her Pulitzer Prize winning book, Demon, forget the last name because it's based on the David Copperfield original, but Demon something. Anyway, it's an amazing book. And she's really highlighting Appalachia and how we stereotype people from certain parts of the United States. And it's the same thing. Like, if we need to be inclusive in all kinds of different ways. And I know I'm never going to be done, but you're so right. This thing around grace, like the places where I've learned the most or when I've made the biggest mistakes, but the other person also was able to hold the relationship with me. And even if the trust was new, even if we didn't know each other well, they were in a place of grace around it. It wasn't even that they were extending grace to me. They just knew that that was part of what they needed to do. Yes. And it just allowed me to be more. And so it's okay if people get mad at us, and that's the right. But when we can hold one another with empathy, I think the learning just is exponentially greater.
Yeah, so, I agree.
Yeah, growth. Very cool. Okay, we are on our soapbox because we're talking about something we love. But I want to finish up. Unless you want to talk about your book a little bit. I know that it's a little early, but I think you're writing a book.
The book is done. I'm just about to. It's in the final round of editing. It's coming out next spring. It's called Stumbling Towards Inclusion: Finding Grace in Imperfect Leadership. So it is an invitation to people to take the risk.
What a perfect time.
The commitment to inclusion is a good one, is a worthy one. And it's not an easy one, but I'm willing to walk alongside you as you take that commitment.
I love that metaphor. It's so helpful. And I think hopefully it will, it does require a certain amount of humility to do this work. And
the book talks a lot about humility. Yes.
Excellent. Well, I want to close with my 4 fun guest questions. I mean, I think they're fun. I don't know if all my guests do, but
I like them, yeah.
Okay, good. So the first one is, what's your favorite morning beverage?
I think, I thought about this. My kids might be the only ones who know this about me. It's water and chia seeds every morning.
Chia seeds. Wow. So do you have to let them ferment? Not ferment.
Sometimes, not always. Sometimes I just drink it, but it's 2 tablespoons of
healthy
chia seeds in like tepid water. And yeah.
Fabulous. Cool. I love the uniqueness of the answers we're getting so far. Okay. What are your core values?
Justice is my first. Vitality is my second. And optimism or enthusiasm is my third.
Oh, beautiful. Love those. And we didn't even get to vitality today. We'll have to have a part 2.
It's part of the mom thing we were talking about, right? Like,
absolutely.
Energy, vitality. Like I exercise every morning. I come to my clients with energy. Like, to me, that's really important.
Yeah. Love that. And we're learning more and more how important that is for us as coaches to be embodied. So what is your most important leadership practice?
I'm not very creative on this one. I'm pretty sure it's reading. I kept thinking of other things, but it's reading. I read. And
do you still read the old-fashioned way? It's not Audible. It's actually reading the book?
No, I didn't do Audible because I get distracted. I read books. I read about 50 to 60 books a year. Yeah, I'm constantly reading. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Which is the last question is, what's one book that you would recommend for folks? And it could be anything.
So many. I mean, look at my bookcase. There's so many. But I honestly think anything by Toni Morrison is going to teach you about identity dynamics. In particular, Recitative is her only published short story. And it has been re-released, I think last year or the year before. It was written in the early 80s and then re-released with a preface by Zadie Smith, which is absolutely breathtaking. But it's an important book because it is the story of 2 girls. My interpretation is it's the story of them, their friendship. But here's the thing. One of them's black, one of them's white, and we never know which one's which. It is up to the reader to examine their unconscious biases and what we project onto those characters based on the conditions and circumstantial evidence we learn through reading this book. And we are an important role character in that story because we're imposing interpretations onto these characters without any evidence except our unconscious.
Oh my goodness. Oh, fabulous. Oh my goodness. That sounds like a really important book for the work that we're talking about.
Yeah, it's available online. It's free. You can read it in an hour, and then you have to, then you won't be able to sleep at night because you will have just read one of the most powerful short stories ever written.
Wow. Okay. All right. It's on my summer list now. I can't wait to talk about that. Okay. Well, that's it. Those are my 4. So I loved having you as a guest. It's been amazing.
Thank you. I love your questions. I just love being with you too. I appreciate your energy, your curiosity, your always constant way of wanting to learn and grow. It's infectious.
Oh, thank you. Well, it is probably one of my core values, if not my purpose. And they're also connected. So be well, and we'll see you on the other side.
All right. Take care, Nina. Thank you.